Okay, hello everyone. So this new video to talk about differences between sun plants and shade plants. So it's a very basic concept if we were to draw these two plants. So in this area here, this plant, the leaves, they would be directly exposed to the sun, whereas this plant here, the leaves would not be directly exposed. Indeed, the sunbeams can hit directly the leaves of this plant because there are no other plants making any shade, whereas the other plant, the pine, well, not be pine tree but coniferous tree, will block most of the sunbeams. Therefore we will have low intensity light coming onto these leaves here. Okay, let's recap these different points. So, sun plant leaf, it's exposed to the sun. Shade plant leaf, it's less exposed to the sun. And the key problem with this is, how do sun leaves prevent water loss? That is the key thing. Water loss is going to be the explanation for the differences between these two leaves. So let's have a look at, so I'm going to follow most of the questions of the back exercise from 2012. So here we go. A bit of labelling to start off with. So these are cross sections of different leaves. So A and B are the ones you have in the back exercise, and this is another one you have in your lesson. It's from a laurel leaf. Okay, so first part we have the upper epidermis. So we have it here for picture A, here for picture B, and here for the laurel leaf. So first thing we can say is that in this plant here there's only one layer of cells, whereas in this one there are three. So obviously the laurel leaf is quite similar to picture B. So it's the most outwards layer of cells, this upper epidermis. Let's have a look at the next one. The palisade mesophyll. So you can see that these cells are tightly packed. It's quite visible on this one here. So if I would just to circle them out, they're tightly packed. If we have a look here, all these cells are tightly packed, so that's the palisade mesophyll. It's got organelles, so these organelles that you can see are chloroplasts. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. Spongy mesophyll, so just underneath the palisade mesophyll. So spongy because there are holes, there are gaps in it, just like a sponge. Let's see if we can circle some of these. So we've got spaces between these cells, so they're not as tightly packed. So same thing on the microscope picture. So all these areas here, there are spaces, gaps where air can come in and be stored. Okay, moving on. So these gaps, they can be called intercellular spaces. Oops, I'll go back once. So intercellular spaces. So in these spaces, there's going to be some gas exchanges. This will enable CO2 to come in. If we're speaking of light conditions, so CO2 will be able to come in and it will be used in photosynthesis by the chloroplasts in these cells. Also O2, which will be produced by the chloroplasts by photosynthesis. This can come out by these spaces. And last thing, water can also come out from these spaces through, okay, I'm going to do it on this one, so they can come out. So water can also come out through these spaces, and that's why water loss can be a problem, and that's why there are going to be differences in the structure to prevent this water loss. So stomata, you have a stomata here, and stomata are here on this one. So these holes, well, there's cells which can be more or less packed against each other. They can let water go through and gases go through. Okay, it's a bit crowded in terms of extra labels, so I'm going to erase all of this. So these spaces, water and gas exchanges mainly. Moving on, so stomatal pore, so also called stomata if you consider what I was saying earlier, the whole thing. So you've got two guard cells, so one on the left, one on the right. Stomata are located slightly in a different positions for picture B. We have one stomata here, one there. So the two guard cells and the hole in the middle. And on the microscope picture, the stomata are these parts here. The slightly darker colour. Okay. So stomatal pore. We'll explain why we have these differences. We're just going to finish labelling. So there's only one label, label 6, the cuticle. So the cuticle is not cells, it's a waxy kind of substance made of a mix of lipids mainly, which prevents water from coming out, which prevents water from evaporating. Okay, let's try and answer. So basically we've done question 1, labelling the different parts. Now we're looking at question 2. Which of the two leaves is from a sun plant? And you have to justify your answer. Okay, so sun plants, they're going to have adaptations for high temperatures, and that means they're adapted to prevent water loss. So, so clearly here, picture B is the sun plant. So the sun plant is B, and so is the laurel leaf, whereas drawing, it's more drawing actually, drawing A is a shade plant. So we're going to try and recap the different things which can explain why one is the sun plant, one is the shade plant. So first thing, shade plants have much thinner leaves, and usually they're much larger. So that's to have an optimal surface. If I would compare it to a sun leaf, the leaves are much thicker and they would be much smaller in terms of surface. Because if you've got a big surface like you've got here for the shade plants, the sunbeams will go on all these parts, and if the light intensity is high, that would cause evaporation. So that's why shade plants, they can have a large surface because the sun is not directly heating them up. So sun plants, they would have a small surface, and in terms of thickness, they're thicker sun plant leaves to conserve water, whereas shade leaves are thinner. Okay, what else can we say? We can see that the stomata, or the stomatal pores, made up of two guard cells, they're not located in the same places. On the shade plant, they're directly in contact with the atmosphere. This is because if you've got a shade plant, it's going to be in less higher temperatures, so water will come out less. So there's only going to be a little bit of water which can evaporate. If you're in the sun and you had this type of leaf, a lot of water would evaporate. So sun leaves, they've got adaptations. The stomata, they are a little bit inside of the plant. They are in a pit where there are also hairs. So this is the pit, and we've got these hairs. So the fact that it's in the pit, it's not directly in contact with the atmosphere, and also the hairs, all the pit and the hairs are going to conserve are going to conserve the water, maintain it in the structure, and also make the temperature a little bit less high. So the hairs, the fact that it's in a crypt, that the stomata are not directly in contact with the atmosphere, these are things which can reduce water loss, and therefore it's another argument that plant B and the laurel leaf are sun leaves. They're adapted to sunny conditions. Okay, so that's so if you read the title of number 5, it's Physiological and Anatomical Differences between Sun and Shade Plants. So we've done the anatomical differences, that is to say the differences in terms of structure, how the leaves are organized, how the structure of the leaves are organized. We are now going to talk about the physiological differences, which are more due to the mechanisms in terms of chemical reactions. Okay, so that was for the structure. Oh, sorry, my mistake. We will come to the physiological differences. I just want to give you a few examples of other plants which have similar adaptations. So marram grass, they grow on beaches where it is sunny and where there is wind. So sun and wind will tend to make water loss a problem. So marram grass, if you look at it under microscope, has these folds, so many folds, and if you look at the folds you can see that there are many hairs. So same thing, it's just like the pits, these hairs and the folds, they're going to keep the water inside, and that means stomata don't directly connect with the atmosphere. Cactuses, they have stomata, but they have much less, and we'll see when they open just on the next page. Water hyacinth is completely different. You can see that it's surrounded by water and not very sunny conditions. So quite interesting. These leaves, they have stomata on both sides, which is quite rare. Usually you only have stomata on the top part, on the lower part, sorry, because on the top parts you have the sun, which can heat and evaporate the water. But as these plants are in water conditions, it is okay that stomata are on both sides, because there's so much water anyway that even if there is a bit of sun, the evaporation is not going to be too high because there will always be water close. So hyacinth is a water plant, so it's going to be more like shade plants. Pine trees, quite interesting. Also, you find them in quite sunny places. If you look in Provence, you've got many pine trees. And the needles, they are actually leaves that have been slightly transformed throughout evolution, and you can see that you have stomata. So stomata is the plural, one stoma. You've got the two guard cells. So same thing, they're slightly protected by the epidermis, and that will prevent air coming in, heat coming in, so therefore the water losses which could come where I've shown the arrows will be lessened. Okay, last thing, so as I was talking about cactuses, this is Opuntia ficus indica, so a type of cactus. What do we have here? We've got the time of day, so this section here is night, same thing here. We can see that transpiration is higher at night, so this is the transpiration rate, so how much water is coming out, and also the CO2 uptake. So for these plants, so cacti being the plural of cactus, at night time there is more CO2 coming in and there is more water coming out. That's an indication that the stomata are present and they are opened only at night. So that's one of the adaptations of cacti, is that in night conditions that's when they open, because there's less heat, less sun. You may wonder how that's possible. It is possible because these plants have a specific photosynthesis which allow them to start one phase of photosynthesis during daytime and during the second phase of photosynthesis during nighttime. You'll understand this concept a bit more later on in the lesson, when we'll cover the two different stages of photosynthesis. Okay, so those were other examples for your general knowledge and maybe help you understand more. So as I was saying, we are now going to talk about the physiological differences, that is to say the differences in terms of metabolism, in terms of different chemical reactions. So we have this graph here, so quite an interesting graph. We've got two plants, so we'll have to find which one is the sun plant and which one is the shade plant. Okay, so before we even answer the questions, we're just going to look at this graph and explain a few things. So first thing, we've got the volume of oxygen. So volume of oxygen on the y-axis, so how much oxygen is produced. And we've got the light intensity on the x-axis. Before we go any further, we're going to need two equations to understand this graph. So I'm going to try a hocus pocus, and normally the equations should appear. So we're going to need these two equations here. So photosynthesis is a reaction, you know, that produces dioxygen. Okay, and respiration is a reaction which takes in oxygen. Bear in mind, plants in dark conditions, they will only do respiration. When there is light conditions, they'll be doing both respiration and photosynthesis. So I'll just repeat that. Bear in mind that plants in dark conditions, they only do respiration, and in light conditions they do both respiration and photosynthesis. This can help us explain the graph. So basically this graph is telling us how efficient is photosynthesis depending on the light intensity, and we know that this photosynthesis efficiency depends on the concentration of dioxygen. You may wonder why there's a zero here. So the zero shows this line where no oxygen is produced. So this means that here and there we've got what is called a compensation point. So for plant number 2, when we are at this amount of light, that means that the dioxygen which is used up by respiration is balanced by the oxygen produced by photosynthesis. So after this compensation point, there is more oxygen produced than there is oxygen that has been used up by respiration. Same thing for plant 1, however, the light intensity is higher. So to get to compensation point, you need more light. So this means that in this part of the graph, this is a case where respiration uses up more oxygen than oxygen is produced by photosynthesis. And this part of the graph is where photosynthesis produces more oxygen than respiration uses up by oxygen. So this is what we call compensation points here, and that can explain this first point. Okay, so first difference is that for number 2, photosynthesis is more efficient at lower lower light intensity. Whereas for plant number 1, photosynthesis is more efficient when you get to higher light intensities. Second thing we can talk about is the light saturation point. So for plant number 2, at this point here, no matter how much light you add, the photosynthesis is at its maximum. You can't produce more by oxygen. For plant 1, the light saturation point is here, so much higher light intensity. And same thing, when you get to this point, photosynthesis is at its maximum in terms of production. You can't produce more dioxygen and more glucose, even though you would put higher light intensity. So which one is which? That is the question. So we can see that photosynthesis is more efficient for these lower light intensities. So number 2 is a shade plant, because shade plants are mostly in low intensity light. So number 2 is a shade plant, whereas number 1 is more efficient for much higher light intensities, so that will be the case of a sun plant. Sun plants, they are exposed to more light, and therefore evolution, selection, natural selection, as a result, these plants are more efficient with higher light intensities. So how could this be linked to their structure? So that's going to be the next slide. So we've said that plant number 2, which is the shade plant, so this one here, I'm just going to put an arrow. So this is the structure of a shade plant, and that's the structure of a sun plant. Different things we can say is that sun plants, they have more, the palisade mesophyll is thicker. That means there are more cells with chloroplast, and each cell has a higher density of chloroplasts. If we compare this to the shade plant, the palisade mesophyll is thinner, and each cell has less chloroplasts. So these two things make that shade plants have much less chloroplasts, and that's why there's this saturation effect. You stop here because all the chloroplasts have enough light. For sunny plants, for all the chloroplasts to have enough light, you need to get to this light intensity here. So that's one of the main differences that can explain the physiology, is that if you have more chloroplasts, you need more light for all the chloroplasts to function. If you've got less chloroplasts, you need less light. So there we are. These are the differences between shade plants and sunny plants. So hopefully you've got all the information now, and that was to give further explanation about the back exercise. Okay, well, thank you very much, and see you for the next video. Bye bye.